Chapter 36, The Cold War Begins. This is 1945 through 1952. So the Cold War is a period of time after World War II till the late 80s, where the United States is at war, sort of, quote unquote, with the Soviet Union. Okay, so Cold War meaning that there's not, going to actually be, the Western Front, but it's definitely tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, between the capitalist America and the communist Soviet Union, that really starts almost immediately after World War II. So this whole chapter is kind of talking about the start of the Cold War. Of course, the Cold War is going to stretch almost until the end of this course, simply because it is a long time. Praise the Lord. Okay, introduction. So at the end of World War II, we had 140 million Americans cheering on our victory. But yes, we did have 4 years of war, but Americans still in the back of their mind remembered those 12 previous years before the war that was depression. So that's still that kind of economic uneasiness was still there. A lot of people thought that after the war economy was over, that America would just head right back into the Great Depression again. So many Americans were very anxious with that. And we see, of course, this being the start of the Cold War, almost immediately after the end of World War II, our relationship with the Soviet Union starts to crumble and, threatens a whole new international conflict. Section A, Post-War Economic Anxieties. Okay, so the 30s had been rough, right? 30s were more or less the time of the Great Depression. Of course, the Great Depression, the crash happened in 29. So the 30s had been very rough. We saw a lot of unemployment. We saw an increase in the suicide rate. We saw a decrease in marriages and a decrease in babies being born, or the birth rate. And like we said before, like I just said, a lot of Americans were thinking we're just going to go right back into the Great Depression once the war ended. Okay, and after the war, the economy did falter a little bit. We see the GNP, or the gross national product, going down. And especially after the war, what was kind of hard on the economy is we got rid of those price controls that had been in place during the war. So we see the price of goods actually increase an average of 33% from 1946 to 1947. And we have just an epidemic of strikes after the war. Remember, during the war, a lot of unions promised not to go on strike. Well, now that the war is over, we see kind of that floodgate open back again. Just in the year of 1946 alone, we see about 4.6 million people going on strikes. So our economy has a little bit of transition to go through after the war. Okay, so 1947, this is the first time the Republicans had control of Congress since more or less the Great Depression. So for 14 years or so. This is the first time Republicans gained control. And Republicans are super annoyed at the growing strength of the unions. Republicans and unions don't usually go along hand in hand. Republicans are more like big business people. So now Republicans are in control. They passed a number of measures that makes life for unions difficult. Most notably is something called the Taft-Hartley Act. Okay? Taft-Hartley Act was just devastating for unions because what it did a couple of things, but the biggest thing it did is it outlawed all union shops. Okay, so factories where if you were working for the factory you had to be in the union, well, they outlawed those through the Taft-Hartley Act. And also they had union leaders take a non-communist oath. But really the biggest thing is outlawing those all-union shops. Some people called it the slave labor law. So it's definitely a kick in the gut. Punch in the gut? Yeah, that'd be more sense. A punch in the gut for the unions. Other obstacles to unionization was the fact that now the West and the South was becoming more industrialized. We see, we'll get into that later. But the West and the South, although they're becoming more industrialized, those are two areas of the country that had always been kind of anti-union. So it was really hard to set up unions in the South and the West where people were just kind of, against unions in general. For example, in the South, the CIO's Operation Dixie aimed at unionizing Southern textile workers, but it failed. Operation Dixie failed, mostly because the workers weren't willing to racially mix. So the black textile workers and the white textile workers weren't willing to unionize together. So that failed, which was not a wonderful thing, of course, for unions. And also we see an increase in the service sector. So instead of like creating buttons or things like this, it's like services, like being a, a secretary, something to that effect. A lot of those jobs were part-time jobs that women had. So those are both obstacles. One that's part-time, one that it's women. Obstacles, I should say, to unionization. And also, a lot of these were smaller jobs. They weren't like in a vast factory where you could go in and unionize a factory. No, it'd be a couple women working here, a couple women working there, a couple women working down the road a ways, so it's hard to unionize them for all of those reasons. All right. However, the federal government, I should say, did take some steps into making sure the economy, kind of helping the economy along after World War II. One of the things they did is they sold a lot of government-owned factories at a really low price, so that helped out a lot of people. Also, they passed something called the Employment Act of 1946, and this Employment Act of 1946 made it government policies to, quote, promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power, unquote. So it set up a 3-member council of economic advisors that would then make recommendations to the president. So it's just another act saying, hey, the government is going to be somewhat actively involved in helping the economy. Another big thing that helps out the economy is the GI Bill, right? GI, that's the nickname we give to veterans of World War II. So the GI Bill, its technical name, proper name, is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. What that did is it helped send veterans to school. And really the motivation behind this is that the fact we had 15 million men off fighting World War II, and people were fearful that our economy couldn't really receive 15 million men. So the idea is like send some of those men to school to let our economy kind of soak in the men as they graduate, so to speak. So we were afraid, the motivation for the GI Bill was really the fact that we were scared that we couldn't really encapsulate 15 million men or 15 million new jobs. So we sent some of those folks to school. So this is the GI Bill. About 8 million of those 15 million men took advantage, and that cost about $14.5 billion. Another organization I was around is the VA. Of course, the VA is still around today. VA stands for Veteran Administration. And what it did is it gave $15 billion in loans for new houses, for farms, for small businesses, that sort of things, to help the veterans kind of get readjusted to civilian life. So yeah, there were definitely some proactive steps the government took to help our economy move along. Section B, the long economic boom, 1950 through 1970. Wow, I said 1970. We're getting kind of modern, praise the Lord. Okay, a long story short, Section B, our economy is awesome, right? But let's get some details. Okay, so 1950 through 1970, we see just this sustained growth of our economy. It keeps growing and growing and growing, and we were the envy of the world. Everyone else was in ruins, and our economy was just booming, going right along. The average national income doubled in the 1950s, and then for this new average in the 50s, it doubled again in the 60s. That's some growth, to say the least. Americans made up about 6% of the global population, but we had about 40% of the wealth. Just saying right again, our economic stuff was booming. And this prosperity allowed for social mobility. So the more money you had, the higher on the social ladder you could be. So this mobility really helped kind of create an environment conducive for things like the civil rights movement that we'll see happening in the 60s, and also helped fund welfare, helped fund Medicaid, that sort of thing. And plus, this economic boom really gave us confidence to really step up as America into the international realm and really take leadership. Because remember, after World War II, we're like, we don't want that responsibility. But now our economic situation is booming. We really have that confidence to step up and be like, hey, we're going to get things done. Yes. Okay. And now, a chicken in every pot, that was a promise I think Hoover had made during his presidency, that he wanted to put a chicken in every pot. Well, that was not going to cut it for Americans now. Now Americans wanted more, right? We want 2 cars. We want a swimming pool. We want a vacation home. Really, we are increasing our standards of what we think living should be. And really, a big consequence of the boom, or something that's really a telltale sign of the boom, this economic boom, is really how many people actually owned their own homes. We see about in the 1960, 60% of Americans own their home. That's really a good telltale sign of economic health. Anyway, the group that benefited perhaps the most from this boom were women. It's really the service industry that's really blooming, and women take a lot of those jobs. So we start to see this kind of clash a little bit. We still see the traditional homemaker being glorified as this awesome thing. You can make a chicken and clean a house and all of that fun stuff. But on the other hand, we see a lot of women in the workforce. A lot of women, a lot, relatively speaking, of women stayed in industry, but we also see a growth in kind of women's jobs as well. So that kind of friction is kind of starting right away after World War II. And we'll see that take effect in the 60s with the feminist movement. Okay, Section C, the roots of post-war prosperity. So Section B told us there was a lot of prosperity. Section C is going to tell us why and where. Okay. So why this economic prosperity? Well, World War II, we had a lot of war contracts, right? We were building tanks, we were feeding the Allies, all of that sort of thing. And we really kind of became a quote-unquote a permanent war economy, okay? We'll see in the 50s, we're not there yet, but we'll see in the 50s the Korean War, and that will, help us along with our economy as well, making supplies for the Korean War. We also see a lot of research and development, and these equal jobs, right? We're researching aerospace, so like going into space, right? Aerospace, plastics, electronics, that sort of thing. And all of this was fueled, this economic boom after World War II was really fueled by cheap fuels, okay? So at this time, the United States and Europe, more or less, European and American companies really owned the oil in the Middle East, so to speak. So it was these corporations or companies that could really set the price at whatever they wanted. So really, the price of oil today is dictated by how much oil is sold on the international market. So Americans and Europeans wanted oil prices to be low, so they mined, I don't know what the right term is, they produced a lot of oil, so there's a big supply. That means the price will be down. So nonetheless, fuel was cheap because Americans and Europeans dictated the prices. So we see a lot of things. We see the increase of highways because oil is cheap, gas is cheap, you can go a-traveling. We see increases in things like air conditioners that take a lot of energy as well. What else do we want to see? We have grids of electric cables, and just, it's really this, our industry is fueled by this cheap fuel. Praise the Lord. By 1970, we see for 1 work hour a worker puts in, we see about twice as much produced because of better education and also because more efficient machinery. So we see industry becoming more efficient as well. In the first 25 years post-war, we see a double in the standard of living. And we also see a shift in the post-war economy. We see agricultural workers. We see less and less actual people working in agriculture, but we also see a huge increase in productivity. So we see a lot of consolidation of farms. So it's not like every, family has a small plot of land they farm. Now farms are huge, okay? People are investing in a lot of expensive machinery. They have fertilizers that really increase production. And we really see kind of the family farm being an artifact of the past. Now we see farms being kind of this almost big business, big operations as well. But gone are the days of, plowing behind an oxen in the sun. Now farmers get to sit in an air-conditioned cab of a tractor and listen to their favorite radio programming. So a huge shift in agriculture as well. By the end of World War II, we see 15% of workers in the agricultural field, and then even at the turn of the 21st century, it's about 2%. So we see the amount of people working agriculture go down, but at the same time, we see the amount of production going way up. So now you know. You're educated. Isn't that lovely? Okay, section D, the smiling Sun Belt. Oh, great. All right, so like we've mentioned in other chapters, World War II really shook up, I don't know the word, demographics in the United States. So people are moving all over the place. And that is definitely true after World War II. Between 1945, 1975, those 30 years there, we see every year about 30 million people move. So people are on the move. And this was really felt by families. They really put stress on families. Because before, you kind of stayed in your same hometown. Your grandpa was there, your great-grandpa was there, that sort of thing. But now people are moving around. They don't have mom and dad living down the street. And a telltale sign of this is really the increase in kind of these how to raise your children books. For example, an illustrative example, Dr. Benjamin Spock had a book called The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. And I mean, this is a sign of the stress put on family, because before you didn't need a book on how to raise the kid. You just asked mom, "Hey mom, how do you wash an infant? Oh, mom, what do you do once they start teething?" All of that stuff. Well, now mom doesn't live down the street anymore, so we see people buying books, to take the place of that wisdom. So back to the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt is 15 states. It kind of makes a smiley face across the bottom of the United States. So like Virginia, Florida, Texas, Arizona, California, that Sun Belt there. We see an increase in population of those states, a big growth, especially in California. By 1950s, about 1/5 of the population lives in California. Even today, I think it's like 1 in 8 Americans live in California. It's kind of a big deal. Anyway, we see the South and the Southwest becoming this new frontier. We see a lot of growth in the Sun Belt. They have better climate, some would argue, down there. They had available jobs. They had better taxes, or less taxes, I should say. And it really prospered mostly because of federal spending. Remember, even FDR during the war gave a lot of those war contracts to the South to help bolster their industry. Well, the same sort of thing is happening post-war. A lot of government contracts are still going to these Sun Belt states. And really, in juxtaposition of the Sun Belt, we get to the Rust Belt. Okay, the Rust Belt is kind of the Ohio River Valley area, and they were often rivals for government contracts. But we see mostly these contracts are going to be kind of disproportionately given to the Sun Belt to help them go along. And then, most prosperity in the 50s and the 60s really was fueled by this, colossal military budget we did have. It'll make more sense once we start talking about the Cold War in depth. Hooray! Okay, section E, the rush to the suburbs. Yay, the suburbs. Okay. So in all regions, not just the North, not just the South, but everywhere, we see whites really fleeing the city and going into the suburbs. For example, we see a lot of organizations set up to help people be able to afford homes. For example, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, which is one of the only New Deal programs to actually stick around after the war. The FHA would give you loans to buy a house. Also for vets, the VA, the Veteran Administration, would give you loans to buy houses. So it made better economical sense to own a home than to rent an apartment in the city. So we see kind of a flight of the whites out of the city. By 1960, 1/4 of Americans lived in the suburbs. 1 in 4, that's a lot. But we have to actually build the suburbs. So what would happen is that a lot of suburbs would be built in kind of a cookie cutter fashion. A good example of these homes built in this way, in this kind of assembly line cookie cutter fashion are called Levitt Towns, or Levitt Town is an example. Levitt Towns were built by the Levitt brothers, and it was exactly what I said, cookie cutter assembly line. So the houses would look the same, maybe they're painted in a different color, something like that, but they laid the foundation. They go to the next house, lay the foundation, and someone would be framing the house after them, someone would be doing the electrical after them, but they build like these huge just expanses of homes relatively quickly and relatively inexpensively, and people just flooded these. They flocked to these in the millions. Okay, so the Levitt Towns. And we really see, like I said, the white flight. So it was also definitely a racial aspect to this. We see the whites leaving the city, being able to afford homes, going to the nicer, newer suburbs. And then we see a lot of African Americans kind of taking their place. Most notably, a lot of African Americans from the South who used to be, cotton pickers, but were displaced by that automated cotton picking machine. Those blacks would then go and kind of fill in where the whites had fled. And with them, of course, unfortunately, came a lot of, rural poverty from the South. So we see really it's a racial thing going on as well. And with the white flight of white Americans from the cities to the suburbs, we also see a lot of companies following them. We see this is really when we have the birth of the shopping mall. So if you had a clothing store downtown, your customers no longer live downtown, so you're going to build a store out in the suburbs where your customers are. Oh, shopping malls. Okay, and when we're talking about segregation, you have to talk about how the government policies actually kind of encouraged it. For example, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration / maybe it's authority, I don't remember, cited the risk of making a loan to a black family. So we see a lot of black families not being able to get loans from the FHA. And even, the public housing programs. Public housing is when the government owns maybe an apartment building, and the apartment buildings are then offered at kind of a discounted rate to those who can qualify for them. Even these public housing projects were built with segregation in mind. So if they're going to build some public housings for blacks, they're going to build those public housing in areas or neighborhoods where there are already a lot of black folks. So that increases segregation, as in it is segregation. Okay, last section for this video, we're getting close, section F, the post-war baby boom. Okay, so it's not violence towards babies, it's just an increase in the number of babies, right? Just to make that clear. So the baby boom was a huge leap in the birth rate the first 15 years after the war. And really we see this boom peak in 1957, and then even, I think, ever since then it has been steadily kind of declining, with some exceptions. Anyway, and we see this really causing a wave. So we have, especially during the Great Depression, remember that birth rate decreased because people weren't getting married, because people couldn't afford families, that sort of thing. So we really see this kind of shock wave of a huge growth of these baby boomers, children of a lot of veterans of World War II. So when they go to elementary schools, we see elementary schools really expanding, and they go to middle schools and they'd see the middle schools expanding, and then high schools expanding, and then, college is expanding. But in the wake of this wave, kind of sort of speak, we see a lot of unemployed teachers, a lot of schools that are closing. And culture really followed along with these baby boomers. When the baby boomers became teenagers, there was, an increase in the youth culture, a lot more marketing towards teenagers, jeans, that sort of thing. In the 80s, once these baby boomers got to the job market, although some of them got there before the 80s, we see a very fierce job market. And even today, we see another kind of secondary boom once the baby boomers had children kind of in the early 90s, that sort of thing, late 80s, early 90s. We see another kind of growth in the birth rate. And now we're just kind of seeing what these the baby boomers, they're getting at retirement age, and we're going to see if the Social Security system can accommodate such a large group of people. So my family is a perfect example of this. Both my grandpas are World War II veterans. Both my parents would be considered baby boomers, and then I would be considered in the secondary boom, right? The children of baby boomers. So, yay, history. Okay. Yes. Okay, with that is it. We're going to just continue on kind of more with the politics of the beginning of the Cold War in the next video.